Pradeep Taneja, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne, joining us right now to speak more. Pradeep, thank you so much for joining us. You know, the goalpost shifted again and letter ultimatums instead of more negotiated deals. What did they tell you about Trump's trade brinkmanship? Has it exposed its own limits, or is it still too early to tell?
I think Trump administration's approach to global trade has been very chaotic and very destructive. It makes it very difficult for other countries, particularly countries in this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific region, to deal with the United States. I mean, how do you prepare to engage in international trade with a country like the United States, which is, of course, very important, indispensable even for many countries. But given that policies change all the time, policies announced today and tomorrow, it is changed again. So given this uncertainty, I think it is a very destructive approach. And I don't see any clarity even after the 1st of August.
Right. And President Trump really has announced a new tariff rates, a looming August 1st deadline. What economic strategy do you really see behind this timing and structure? Well, I guess he's seeing that it would really be beneficial to try and strike an agreement versus sending them letters with higher tariffs as he's threatened.
Well, I think there are 18 countries around the world which are significant trading partners of the United States, countries with which the U.S. has a trade, major trade deficit, and the whole strategy seems to be targeting those countries. There are another 100 countries, smaller trading partners of the United States, and apparently President Trump is writing letters to these countries. So we don't know what the content of this letter is, what the strategy is, but the focus has been, I think, on these 18 countries, and negotiations have been on. We've seen, for example, there's been a framework agreement with the United Kingdom. There is also a framework agreement with Vietnam, and I suspect that for some of the countries in Southeast Asia, the approach might be similar to the one with Vietnam. So the Vietnam Framework Agreement might become a template for other countries in the region.
Well, we also understand that there are some, take it or leave it kind of offer letters that's also going out today, targeting smaller countries. What do you think is the rationale behind this?
I think with the smaller countries, negotiations are going to be easy because they have really no bargaining power. Most of these countries are very small, trading nations, and their trade with the United States is significant for these countries, but it's not significant for the United States. So U.S. would be able to apply its own sort of will and force its will on these smaller countries. But I think what we have to watch is the major trading partners, countries like Vietnam, countries like China, obviously, is the big fish. But India, for example, President Trump has been saying that a trade agreement with India is on the anvil, that it could be announced any day. But so far, we haven't heard anything from the Indian side. So countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia might be much more important, and Thailand, of course, much more important for the U.S. than some of the smaller countries in the region.
Well, Japan is another country to really look out for because there's been some resistance from some allies, and Japan is one of them, where the Prime Minister has vowed not to easily compromise on Trump's tariffs. Which countries are most likely to resist or hold out under U.S. pressure? And perhaps you could also share with us, how far do you think the U.S. is willing to go in pressing its demands?
I think Japan and Australia are going to be the two difficult countries to reach an agreement with, because both Japan and the United States, and Japan and Australia, and perhaps we can also include Republic of Korea in this, South Korea. And these countries are U.S. strategic allies. The whole Indo-Pacific strategy is based on U.S. alliances with these countries. And these countries have not been given any concession. Australia, for example, has a trade deficit with the United States. So U.S. runs a trade surplus with Australia, but still Australia is being subjected to these punitive tariffs. And given the strategic significance of both Japan and Australia, I think these countries are unlikely to surrender their trade sovereignty, and they are going to drive a hard bargain.
And, beyond economics, what are really the risks of undermining long-standing alliances or regional trade partnerships? Could this create openings for rivals like China to increase influence?
I think there is a significant risk of undermining US strategic interests because, as I mentioned earlier, countries like Australia and Japan are essential almost to the US, Indo-Pacific strategy in trying to counter China's aggressive behavior over the past few years. And if trade, if the US insists on imposing these punitive tariffs on countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even India, then it will undermine public trust in the bilateral relationship. Already, we have seen in Australia, for example, there have been surveys conducted by the Lowy Institute where we have seen there's been a decline in trust in the United States. So this is going to be a problem, but the Trump administration doesn't seem to see these two things as interrelated. I mean, trade and strategic interests are interrelated, but President Trump doesn't seem to think so. So we'll see how this, is ultimately resolved. But certainly, there is no reason for countries like Australia and Japan to sign on to an unfair trade deal with the United States.
And with all this that we've discussed so far, do you think, President Trump is being extremely objective, specifically because he claims that these tariffs are really to protect Americans, the American industries, but are they more likely to help or hurt US consumers and businesses in the short term?
But the logic of tariff is very simple. The tariff is paid by the companies in the importing country. And usually the importers would pass it on to the consumers. And even if the importers, they say that, they're going to take some of the burden off the consumers, but ultimately these products will cost more to American consumers. And the risk is that this could actually add to inflation in the United States. So, but President Trump seems to believe that tariff is the key principle of international trade. He said that tariff is the most beautiful word in the English language. He loves tariffs, and nothing else seems to really matter. This seems to be a key part of his economic strategy.
Thank you so much for speaking to us and sharing your insights with us. Pradeep Taneja, Senior Lecturer in Asian Studies at the University of Melbourne.